On the 16th of September, 1991, at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the lodge housekeeper knocked softly on the Honeymoon suite's door. She tried again, louder this time. Still silence. She frowned. Newlyweds often slept in, she told herself, but something felt off. The car was still parked neatly outside, untouched. The curtains inside the room hung half open, and when she pressed her ear to the door, all she heard was the faint tick of the wall clock inside. No voices, no movement, nothing. Hours passed before the staff decided to use the master key when the door finally creaked open. What they saw chilled them. The bed had been slept in, but it was neatly made, as if someone had slipped away in the night. Caroline's purse sat open on the dresser. Daniel's wallet and keys lay on the nightstand. 2 champagne glasses rested on the small wooden table. A thin ring of bubbles dried along the rims. Everything was there except for Caroline and Daniel. The housekeeper stepped out of the room, her hands trembling as she called for the manager. Within minutes, the police were phoned. At first, the officers who arrived thought it might be nothing. Maybe the couple had gone for an early hike, but as they walked the grounds, scanning the trails and checking the dining hall, the unease grew heavier. Their coats and hiking boots were still inside. Their car had not moved. By noon, it was no longer just a missing persons call. It was the start of a nightmare. The lodge staff gathered in the lobby, whispering. Some said maybe they'd argued. Others thought maybe they'd been taken. But nobody could understand how 2 people could vanish without leaving even a footprint. The first calls went out to Caroline's parents and Daniel's family. "We can't find them," the manager said, his voice trembling over the line. Shock turned to fear. Fear turned to panic, and within hours, officers were spreading out into the forest, calling their names, into the trees. But the woods only answered with silence. That was the last moment anyone could pretend this was ordinary, because Caroline and Daniel Brooks, 2 newlyweds who should have been starting a life together, had disappeared without a trace. And the truth about what happened to them was far darker than anyone could have imagined. On the 16th of September, 1991, by noon, the quiet charm of the Catskill Lodge had transformed into something else. Entirely panic, the housekeeper stood pale and trembling as officers moved in and out of the Honeymoon suite, snapping photographs of untouched belongings, bagging the champagne glasses, and dusting for prints. Guests lingered in the hallways, whispering in uneasy tones. A place that usually smelled of pine and wood smoke now felt heavy with fear. The officers searched the immediate area first. They walked the trails behind the cabin, calling out, "Caroline, Daniel." Their voices echoed into the woods, swallowed by silence. A deputy shined a flashlight into the creek that ran nearby, but the water flowed steady and clear, offering no answers. It was as though the forest itself refused to give up its secrets. Inside the lodge, the manager sat at the front desk, dialing number after number. By then, both families had been reached. Caroline's mother cried out on the phone, begging for details. Daniel's father demanded answers. The staff didn't have the word missing, didn't sit right. It felt too neat for something terrifying. By late afternoon, more officers arrived. Flashlights, radios, notepads in hand, they cordoned off the cabin with yellow tape. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to Caroline's scarf. At first, the hounds pulled forward, leading handlers into the woods. But within a few yards, the trail went cold. The dogs whined, circling confused. That was worse than finding nothing. It meant someone had gone out of their way to erase a trail. Guests began checking out early. A newlywed couple from Boston refused to stay another night, whispering to each other as they carried their suitcases. If it happened to them, it could happen to us. By evening, the once bustling dining hall was empty. Chairs stacked, silverware untouched. The whole place felt abandoned. Detectives sat in the suite, late into the night, going over details. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no blood. It looked as if Caroline and Daniel had simply stood up and walked away, but their keys were still there. Their coats were still there. Why would they leave in the middle of the night, unprepared? One detective muttered what everyone else was thinking, but didn't want to say out loud. Somebody took them. That night, the police issued an official missing persons alert. The story of the vanished honeymooners spread quickly. Through the town, phones rang. Reporters gathered. Families drove frantically toward the Catskills, clinging to the hope that Caroline and Daniel would somehow walk through the lodge doors again. But deep down, even in those first 24 hours, the fear had already taken root. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't two people lost in the woods. Something terrible had happened. By the next morning, the forest around the lodge looked less like a peaceful getaway and more like a crime scene. Patrol cars lined the dirt road. Volunteers stood in clusters, clutching flashlights, maps, and radios. Some were neighbors. Some were strangers who had heard the news and felt compelled to help. They fanned out in long lines, calling Caroline's and Daniel's names into the trees. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made hearts race. Dogs barked, pulling at their leashes. But again and again, the scent trails seemed to vanish into nothing. It was like chasing ghosts. Helicopters buzzed overhead, blades chopping through the still air, spotlights sweeping across the forest floor. From above, the woods looked endless, a sea of green and shadow. Searchers below felt it too, like the forest itself was, swallowing the couple whole. Inside the lodge, families arrived. Caroline's parents clutched each other tightly, faces pale with exhaustion and dread. Daniel's brother stormed through the halls, demanding updates from detectives who had none to give. The pain in their voices cut deeper than any news report. This wasn't a story to them, it was their children. Reporters swarmed outside, turning the lodge parking lot into a circus of microphones, cameras, and vans. The story was spreading fast. Headlines already screamed, "Honeymoon horror, newlyweds disappear without a trace." But the louder the story grew, the more haunting the silence from the forest became. No footprints, no blood, no personal items left behind in the woods. It didn't add up. People don't vanish into thin air. And yet, Caroline and Daniel had. At night, the volunteers returned, faces streaked with sweat and dirt, voices hoarse from shouting names into the void. Some refused to stop, returning the next morning, convinced they had missed something. Others admitted quietly that they felt the couple wasn't out there at all. And somewhere, far from the noise of helicopters and the hum of radios, Mark was watching it all unfold on the evening news. His face stayed calm, but inside he knew what no one else yet dared to believe. The searchers weren't going to find Caroline and Daniel alive. They were looking in the right forest, but not in the right place. Within days, the disappearance of Caroline and Daniel wasn't just a local mystery, it was national news. major networks sent crews into the sleepy Catskills. Town anchors with polished voices sat under makeshift tents in front of the lodge, reporting live as cameras captured every new development, or lack of one. Headlines flashed across the evening broadcasts: newlyweds vanish on honeymoon. Morning shows ran segments with wedding photos, Caroline in her ivory gown, Daniel smiling nervously as he slipped the ring on her finger. Those images, so full of life and hope, were now paired with words like missing, vanished, feared, dead. For viewers at home, it was irresistible and heartbreaking. How could two young people, fresh from vows of forever, disappear within days of their wedding? It wasn't just news. It felt like a nightmare anyone could stumble into. Outside the lodge, the parking lot turned into a buzzing hive of reporters. Cameras zoomed in on every movement of police officers, every word from the families. Microphones were shoved toward tearful faces, desperate for quotes. Caroline's mother's sobs were replayed on evening TV. Daniel's brother's angry outbursts became headlines. The story stopped being theirs alone. It belonged to the world. Now, speculation fed the frenzy. Some commentators suggested the couple had staged their disappearance, a wild idea that enraged the families. Others pushed theories of a hiking accident or a predator lurking in the woods. One tabloid even hinted at a secret lover. Each rumor twisted the knife deeper. Meanwhile, the families had to endure not only their grief, but the unrelenting spotlight. Every glance, every tear, every silence was analyzed by strangers. Caroline's father whispered to a detective, "We just want them back, please, before the cameras eat us alive." Behind closed doors, detectives knew this wasn't an accident. Too many details didn't fit. A belongings left behind, a locked cabin, a vanished trail. The pieces pointed toward something darker, something human. But who? Whispers started spreading through the press as well. A name surfaced quietly, always in the background: Mark, the ex-boyfriend. Some reporters dug into his past, finding old classmates who described him as jealous, the kind who couldn't let go. Those hints soon turned into speculation, and speculation turned into suspicion. The story had gone from mystery to manhunt. And though no one dared say it outright on television, yet the question was building louder and louder. Was this really a disappearance? Or was it murder? The day came when both families stood in front of a wall of cameras, their faces hollow with exhaustion and grief. It wasn't their choice. Detectives had urged them. The public plea might shake something loose. Maybe someone had seen something. Maybe a witness would finally step forward. Caroline's mother clutched a framed wedding photo to her chest. Her voice trembled as she leaned toward the microphones. "Please," she whispered. "If anyone knows where Caroline and Daniel are, please bring them home." She didn't look at the cameras. She couldn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the photograph, as if her daughter might somehow hear her through it. Daniel's brother, Michael, stepped up next. He was only 19, but the fury in his voice filled the room. They didn't walk away. They didn't vanish by choice. Somebody knows what happened, and whoever it is, you won't get away with it. His words weren't polished, but they were raw, and that rawness cut through millions of living rooms across the country. The press conference was replayed endlessly. Reporters called it heartbreaking. Viewers described it as unbearable to watch. For the families, though, it was worse than unbearable. It was humiliation. Their private pain had become a spectacle. Yet still they did it, because if it meant one tip, one lead, one person coming forward, then maybe it would be worth it. But as the days stretched on, the tips remained useless. Someone thought they saw Caroline at a gas station. False. Someone swore Daniel was in a truck stop diner. Wrong again. Each dead end piled onto the weight of despair, and the whispers about Mark grew louder. Detectives asked the families about him. Caroline's father admitted she had once mentioned him being too intense. Her college roommate recalled a night Caroline confessed, "I feel like he'll never really let me go." Those words, harmless years ago, now echoed like a prophecy. The press conference changed something else too. The sympathy of the public turned into outrage. The town square filled with candles and posters, strangers holding vigils. A woman who had never met Caroline told a reporter, "It feels like we all lost someone. It could have been any of us." Back in their quiet homes, though, the families didn't feel hope. Caroline's mother admitted later, "That was the day I stopped expecting her to walk back through the door." It was also the day detectives stopped treating this as a missing persons case. From that moment on, it was a murder investigation. Detectives had combed through every possible theory. An accident on the trails, a robbery gone wrong, even the wild idea that Caroline and Daniel had staged their disappearance, but the facts never matched. Their belongings were untouched. Their car sat unused. Their coats and hiking boots hadn't left the cabin. One detective finally said what others were thinking. This wasn't nature. This was someone. The investigation turned inward toward the people who had once been part of Caroline's and Daniel's lives, friends, co-workers, old classmates. Most interviews yielded nothing but tears and confusion. But again and again, one name surfaced: Mark. He wasn't mentioned loudly at first, always a little reluctantly. There was an ex-Caroline's college friend told investigators he didn't take the breakup well. Another added he wasn't dangerous, just intense. But then a third recalled a night years earlier, outside a bar, when Mark had shouted at Caroline, "If I can't have you, nobody will." That phrase burned in the detectives' minds. When they looked into Mark's background, the surface looked clean. No arrests, no restraining orders. A steady, though unremarkable job to the casual eye. He was ordinary, but ordinary men don't come up again and again in stories of obsession. Neighbors filled in more of the picture. They remembered him pacing his yard late at night, muttering under his breath. They remembered seeing him drive off at odd hours, returning with mud splattered across his truck. One neighbor swore she heard a car door slam in his driveway around midnight. The same night, Caroline and Daniel vanished. The pieces weren't evidence yet, but they formed a shape detectives couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the families grew restless. Daniel's father cornered an officer outside the lodge one evening, his voice sharp with anger. "You know it's him. Why aren't you putting him in cuffs?" The officer lowered his voice. "We need proof. Without it, he walks." And proof was exactly what they didn't yet have. No fingerprints tying him to the cabin. No witnesses placing him near the lodge. No weapon, just whispers and shadows. Still, detectives felt the pull of certainty. Caroline had moved on with Daniel. She had found happiness, and in Mark's mind, happiness with someone else. was betrayal. They couldn't prove it yet. But they were sure of one thing. If Caroline and Daniel were dead, the man responsible was already walking free. And he was watching, always watching. Detectives finally knocked on Mark's door. It was a small rental house at the edge of town, curtains drawn even in broad daylight. When he opened the door, he looked startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone, let alone police. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes seemed sunken from too many sleepless nights. "Mark Reynolds?" one detective asked. "Yeah," he muttered, gripping the door frame. "Would like to ask you a few questions about Caroline Brooks." Her name made him flinch, barely noticeable, but detectives caught it. They asked if he knew Caroline was missing. He nodded stiffly. "Heard it on the news." "When was the last time he saw her?" "Years ago," he said, his voice flat. "Did he attend the wedding?" "No." "Did he know Daniel?" "Not really." On paper, the answers seemed clean, but in the room they felt wrong, too clipped, too rehearsed. And while his words said innocent, his trembling hands said otherwise. Detectives pressed further. A neighbor had seen his truck late at night, mud on the tires. Another recalled a car door slamming after midnight. "What did Mark have to say about that?" He shrugged. "I go for drives sometimes. It clears my head." They noted the faint smell of earth and gasoline lingering near his porch. They noticed the way his gaze never stayed still, bouncing from the table to the window to the floor. Hay was nervous, but not the kind of nervous you'd expect from a man worried about being falsely accused. This was something deeper. Back at the station, detectives pieced together more. Old friends described him as obsessive. Hay used to call Caroline non-stop. One said she'd cry to me, saying she felt trapped. Another admitted Caroline once confessed, "He'll never let me go. I just know it." The pattern was undeniable. He hadn't gotten over her. He had carried that obsession for years, letting it fester until it boiled over. But obsession isn't evidence. Detectives needed something concrete. They decided to put him under watch at 24 hours, quiet, invisible. If Mark had done this, eventually he would slip, and as officers watched him pace his living room late into the night, muttering to himself, one thing became clear. Mark wasn't a man grieving Caroline's disappearance. He was a man hiding something buried. Detectives didn't confront Mark again right away. They knew better instead. They pulled back and set eyes on him from a distance. Two plainclothes officers in an unmarked car parked down his gravel lane. Others rotated shifts, making sure no hour of his day went unobserved. If Mark had something to hide, eventually his behavior would give him away. And it did. By day, Mark tried to look ordinary. He went to the corner store for cigarettes, sometimes milk or bread. He watered the plants on his porch. He even nodded politely to a neighbor or two, though his eyes darted nervously, never settling. But at night, he changed. One officer described it later. He looked like a man fighting something inside his own head. Mark paced his backyard, under the dim glow of a single porch light, chain-smoking cigarette after cigarette. Sometimes he muttered out loud, his words carried faintly in the quiet night air. Other times, he stood still for long stretches, staring into the dark woods behind his house, as if they were staring back. Then came the late-night drives. Around midnight, He would load something into his truck, a shovel, once, a heavy-looking bag, and disappear down winding back roads. He never drove toward town, always into the trees, where headlights vanished quickly into blackness. Hours later, he would return, his clothes streaked with dirt, the smell of earth clinging to him. Detectives logged every movement, every trip, every pause. But what made their suspicions harden was what he didn't do. He never joined the searches for Caroline and Daniel, never stood beside the families at vigils, never once spoke to reporters to defend himself or to express concern while the whole town grieved. Mark remained silent, isolated to detectives. That silence screamed louder than any words. Neighbors grew uneasy. One admitted she stopped letting her kids play in the yard after dark. Another said she'd hear his truck start up at odd hours and shivered, whispering to her husband, "He's going back out there, isn't he?" Inside the station, detectives debated their next move. They didn't have enough for an arrest, not yet. But they were certain Mark was circling something, maybe the burial site itself. The danger was that if he realized he was being watched, he might move faster, destroy evidence, bury the truth deeper. Still, they waited. Because patience, they knew, could be the difference between a suspicion and a conviction. And sure enough, the patience paid off. One night, Mark finally made a mistake. It happened on a foggy night, just past midnight. Detectives tailing Mark noticed him load his truck with more urgency than usual this time. It wasn't only a shovel. He carried a large black garbage bag, heavy enough that he dragged it rather than lifted it. He glanced over his shoulder twice, his face pale in the dim porch light, before slamming the tailgate shut. The unmarked car followed at a safe distance, headlights off until the road stretched wide. Mark drove deep into the forest, farther than before. The road narrowed into a dirt track, branches scraping against the sides of his truck. When he finally stopped, the officers killed their engine and watched. Mark stepped out, shovel in one hand, the bag in the other. He vanished into the trees. The woods swallowed him, leaving only the faint crunch of soil under his boots. The detectives called for backup in hushed voices, their radios crackling softly, but they didn't follow too close. They knew better. If he spooked, the truth might be buried forever. 20 minutes later, Mark emerged, his clothes streaked with fresh mud, his boots heavy with clumps of earth. The bag was gone. He tossed the shovel carelessly into the bed of the truck, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and drove off. The moment his taillights disappeared, officers crept into the forest. With flashlights, the ground was damp, the air carrying the sharp scent of disturbed soil. 50 yards in, they found it, a patch of earth darker than the rest. Loose, freshly dug, the outline of a shallow pit was unmistakable. When they brushed the dirt aside, something silver glinted. It was Caroline's bracelet, the one her mother had given her the night before the wedding. Beside it lay a bundle of wedding invitation cards, tied with ribbon, now damp and smeared with mud. The officers stood in silence. The forest felt heavier, as if the trees themselves had been holding their breath. It wasn't the bodies, not yet. But it was enough to confirm their worst fears. Mark wasn't wandering the woods aimlessly. Hay was tending to his secrets. At the station, detectives spread the items across the evidence table. Parents were called in to identify the bracelet. Her mother collapsed, sobbing, when she saw it. Daniel's father clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles bled. The walls around Mark were closing fast, but detectives knew they still needed more. A bracelet and invitations wouldn't lock him away forever. They needed undeniable proof. And as fate would have it, Mark gave it to them himself. During a late-night phone call to an old drinking buddy. His voice low and ragged, he muttered, "They won't find them where I put them." That slip, recorded on a wiretap, turned suspicion into certainty. The next, dig into the forest, wouldn't uncover trinkets, it would uncover the truth. Dawn broke cold and grey as a convoy of patrol cars and evidence vans crept down the same dirt road. Mark had driven nights, before the forest was hushed damp from morning dew, its stillness broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant hum of generators. Detectives had marked the spot where the bracelet and invitations were found. Now they were back with shovels, forensic teams, and a grim expectation. The digging began. Slowly shovels sliced through the soft soil, each scrape echoing in the silence. Within minutes, one officer's blade struck something solid. He froze, kneeling. He brushed away the dirt with his gloved hands. What emerged first was fabric white, tattered, stained. A murmur rippled through the team. As the soil was cleared, the shape became undeniable. The body Caroline's, her hair, once carefully pinned on her wedding day, was matted with soil. The lace of her gown clung to her frame, torn and filthy, but still recognizable. Not far from her, another form appeared. Daniel, his tuxedo jacket rotted at the seams, his wristwatch cracked but still clinging to his arm. Even seasoned officers, hardened by years of crime scenes, bowed their heads. The weight of it crushed the air around them. This wasn't only a crime, it was the violent end of a love story that had barely begun. The medical examiner worked quickly but carefully. Early signs told a brutal story. Caroline had a fracture at the base of her skull. Daniel's hands showed cuts and breaks, defensive wounds, the marks of a man who had tried desperately to protect them both. It was no accident. It was no random act. This had been planned. News traveled fast. By midday, reporters stood outside the police station, their microphones trembling. As they relayed the discovery, the bodies of Caroline and Daniel Brooks have been found in a shallow grave. One anchor announced, her voice cracking. Across the country, viewers who had hoped for a miracle now sat stunned, hearts sinking with the confirmation of what they feared. For the families, the call was unbearable. Caroline's mother collapsed on the living room floor, wailing. Daniel's brother punched a wall, his hands splitting open. Their grief wasn't the quiet, cinematic kind. It was raw, loud, violent because it was real. And in the middle of it all, detectives turned their eyes fully on Mark. He had denied knowing where they were. He had denied seeing Caroline for years. But the grave told a different story. A story of obsession turned deadly. The grim discovery ended the question of whether Caroline and Daniel were alive. But it opened another, heavier one. The answer would soon come. In handcuffs and courtrooms, the day after the grim discovery, detectives wasted no time. They had the bracelet, they had the wedding invitations, they had the bodies. And most damning of all, they had the recording of Mark's own words. "They won't find them where I put them." At sunrise, patrol cars surrounded his small rental house. The street was quiet, dew still clinging to the grass, but neighbors peeked through their blinds, hearts pounding as they realized what was about to happen. The knock on Mark's door wasn't soft. It was heavy, final. He opened it slowly, blinking into the light. He wore a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair greasy, his face hollow. For a moment, he just stared at the row of officers, his expression unreadable. Then the sheriff stepped forward. His voice was steady, without hesitation. "Mark Reynolds, you are under arrest for the murders of Caroline and Daniel Brooks." Mark's eyes flickered, a tiny twitch, but he said nothing. He didn't protest. He didn't shout. He simply let the cuffs lock around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. As they led him out, his neighbors whispered from behind curtains. One woman crossed herself. Another muttered under her breath, "I knew it." Reporters were already waiting. Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones shoved forward, questions shouted. "Mark, did you kill them? Why did you do it? Were you jealous of Daniel?" He kept his head down, lips pressed tight, as the officers guided him into the back of a patrol car. Inside the station, the interrogation room was bare, just a table, 2 chairs, and the weight of the evidence stacked against him. Detectives slid the bracelet across the table. They played the wiretap recording. They showed him the photos from the grave. Mark leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "That doesn't prove anything," he muttered. His voice was flat, detached, as if he was speaking about strangers. But his hands betrayed him, trembling, restless, unable to stay still. For the families, the arrest was a moment of bitter relief. Caroline's father said, "It doesn't bring her back, but at least now he won't hurt anyone else." Daniel's mother clutched her son's photo, whispering, "Justice, finally." Yet even in custody, Mark refused to confess. He denied, deflected, and sat in silence for long stretches, eyes staring into some dark place only he could see. But denial didn't matter anymore. The grave had spoken louder than any words he could say. For the first time since Caroline and Daniel disappeared, the family slept with a small measure of peace. The man who stole their children's future was behind bars, but this was only the beginning. The trial, the long public battle for justice, was still to come. The courthouse in Millbrook had never seen anything like it. On the first day of Mark's trial, the line to get inside stretched around the block. Reporters with notepads and cameras jostled for space. Alongside grieving neighbors and strangers who simply wanted to witness history. For months, the story of Caroline and Daniel had haunted the town. Now it was time to hear the truth laid out in front of a jury. Mark entered wearing a plain suit, escorted by deputies. The shackles had been removed for appearances, but the weight of his chains still seemed to follow him. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. To some, he looked hollowed out. To others, he looked defiant, like a man who still thought he could beat the system. The families sat only feet away. Caroline's mother clutched her husband's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Danielle's brother glared openly, his fists clenched at his sides. The distance between them and Mark was small, but it felt like a chasm filled with grief, rage, and unanswered questions. The prosecutor wasted no time. This was not an accident. This was not a random act. This was an act of obsession, of jealousy, and of calculated violence. Mark Reynolds stalked, followed, and murdered Caroline and Daniel Brooks. And we will prove it. He laid out the evidence. Piece by piece. The bracelet buried in the soil, the wedding invitations found in the shallow pit, the waterlogged shoe with Daniel's initials, the photographs of the disturbed ground, and then the recording Mark's own voice, muttering, "They won't find them where I put them." The jury sat stiff, eyes dark with concentration. Every word painted the same picture. A man who couldn't let go, a man who chose to bury two lives rather than watch them live happily without him. The defense tried to cast doubt. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Mark's words on the recording were taken out of context. They suggested someone else could have been in those woods, but their arguments rang hollow. Each rebuttal sounded weaker than the last. Witnesses were called. Caroline's college friend spoke about the night. Mark shouted, "If I can't have her, no one will." A neighbor testified about seeing his truck caked in mud the morning after the disappearance. Detectives described following him into the forest and finding the disturbed soil. Piece by piece, the story tightened around him like a noose. Through it all, Mark remained eerily calm. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, he didn't even glance at the families. His face was a mask, blank and unfeeling, but the more he tried to hide, the more the jury seemed to see. The trial dragged on for weeks. Every day, reopening wounds for the families. Caroline's mother said later, every detail was like losing her all over again. Yet, they sat through it because they had to, because justice demanded their presence. By the time closing arguments were made, the air in the courtroom was heavy, electric. Everyone knew the weight of what was about to come. The only question left was whether the jury would see what seemed so obvious to everyone else. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days. Those hours felt endless for the families who waited in the courthouse hallway, pacing, whispering prayers, gripping photographs of Caroline and Daniel, as if holding them tighter could bring them back. Reporters lingered outside, their cameras ready, their voices rehearsing the lines they would deliver. Decision was read. Finally, the call came. The jury has reached a verdict. Inside the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The air was thick, silent, as if the entire building itself was holding its breath. Caroline's mother leaned into her husband's shoulder, trembling. Daniel's brother sat forward on the edge of his chair, jaw clenched. The judge entered, his gavel tapping once for order. "Members of the jury," he said, his voice steady, "have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in his hands. His voice didn't shake. "We have, Your Honor." The words that followed cracked the room wide open. On the charge of first-degree murder of Caroline Brooks, we find the defendant guilty. Caroline's mother let out a sob, muffled by her husband's arms. The sound echoed through the room, raw and heartbreaking. On the charge of first-degree murder of Daniel Brooks, we find the defendant guilty. Daniel's brother shot to his feet, tears streaming as he whispered, "Yes, yes." His father bowed his head, his hands covering his face. For a moment, there was chaos, crying, gasps, even muffled cheers from the back of the courtroom. Mark sat still, his face pale, his jaw tight, but his eyes empty. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't speak. If he felt the weight of the verdict, he buried it as deeply as he had buried Caroline and Daniel. The judge's gavel pounded, calling for order. The defendant is hereby found guilty on all counts and remanded to custody pending sentencing. Officers stepped forward, shackling Mark's wrists once more as they led him away. Caroline's father whispered under his breath, "You'll never haunt her again." Outside, the courthouse steps became a sea of emotion. Reporters delivered the news in urgent tones. Strangers embraced one another. Candles were lit. Flowers laid people who had never met. Caroline or Daniel cried as though they had lost someone close. Justice had been spoken, but it was a bittersweet victory, as Caroline's mother said softly to a reporter, her face wet with tears. "They're still gone. Nothing changes that." The verdict had given the families closure, but closure was not the same as healing. The next step was sentencing, the final nail in the coffin of Mark's freedom. The day of sentencing arrived with heavy skies. The courthouse once again was crowded. Reporters pressed against the doors. Townsfolk filled the benches, and both families sat at the front, bracing themselves for the last painful step of this ordeal. Mark was brought in, wearing an orange jumpsuit this time, his wrists shackled, his face expressionless. He no longer had the benefit of a suit and tie, no longer carried even the appearance of a man with control. He was a prisoner, waiting to hear how much of his life he would spend behind bars. The prosecutor spoke first. His words were firm, deliberate. "Your Honor, this was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of obsession, premeditation, and cruelty. Mark Reynolds stole 2 lives and left 2 families broken beyond repair. The maximum sentence is not only appropriate, it is necessary." Then came the family's turn. Caroline's mother stood, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the podium. Her voice wavered but carried through the room. "My daughter was my best friend. Hay stalked her, hunted her, and buried her like she was nothing. But she was everything to me, everything. I will never forgive him. And I pray that every day he spends in prison, he remembers her face." Daniel's father followed, his tone sharp with anger. "My son was a good man. Hay loved Caroline. He would have built a family, a future. But that was stolen from him for what? For jealousy, for control. This man should never breathe free air again." Mark sat still, his head bowed slightly, eyes fixed on the floor. If their words pierced him, he didn't show it. Nod. A single flicker of remorse passed his face. Finally, the judge adjusted his glasses and delivered the decision. His voice was steady. "Mark Reynolds, for the murders of Caroline Brooks and Daniel Brooks, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down, a sharp crack that echoed like a door slamming shut forever. The families broke into tears, tears of sorrow, but also of relief. Daniel's brother hugged his mother tightly. Caroline's father whispered, "It's done." For the first time since the nightmare began, there was no more waiting, no more uncertainty. Justice had spoken. Mark was led away in chains. He didn't look back. He didn't speak. His figure disappeared behind the heavy wooden doors, swallowed by the justice system that would hold him until his final breath. Outside, the courthouse steps became a memorial. People laid flowers and candles, not for celebration, but for remembrance. The names Caroline and Daniel were spoken again and again, carried in voices soft with grief, but strong with love. The sentencing closed the case, but for those who had loved the couple, the real sentence was living without them. When the trial ended and Mark was locked away, the flood of cameras and reporters finally left Millbrook. The courthouse steps, once buzzing with tension and headlines, stood empty again, but for the families of Caroline and Daniel. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos that came before. Caroline's parents returned to a house that no longer felt like home. Her room upstairs was frozen in time, the perfume on her dresser, the framed graduation photo, the books she had promised to reread. Her mother sometimes went in at night, sitting on the edge of the bed, whispering prayers into the emptiness. Her father coped by keeping busy fixing things around the house, mowing the lawn twice a week, anything to outrun the grief that crept in. During still moments, Daniel's family bore the weight differently. His younger brother confessed to friends, "Every time I laugh, I feel guilty, like he should be here instead of me." His mother spent hours staring at his old baseball trophies, polishing them even though they didn't need it. His father tried to bury himself in work, but co-workers noticed the haunted look that never left his eyes. The town, too, carried scars. Couples who checked into the lodge afterward often cancelled their stays, unnerved by whispers of the honeymoon murders. Eventually, the owners shuttered the cabin where Caroline and Daniel had stayed. Its door locked, curtains drawn forever. Some locals swore it was haunted not by ghosts, but by the silence of lives cut short. Yet, out of the pain, something began to grow. Both families came together, creating the Caroline and Daniel Foundation. Scholarships were offered in Caroline's name for young women pursuing education. A youth sports program was launched in Daniel's honor, teaching kids about teamwork and kindness. These are small acts didn't erase the tragedy, but they gave it meaning, transforming grief into something that could help others. For the wider community, the story became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children about Caroline and Daniel, warning them that love and obsession are not the same. Friends reminded one another to trust instincts, to walk away from danger before it's too late. The town carried the memory like a scar, but also like a lesson. Still, anniversaries were the hardest. On the first one, hundreds gathered in the square with candles, speaking their names aloud, the photos. Caroline's radiant smile, Daniel's proud grin were placed at the center. As the crowd fell silent, their love, though short-lived, felt eternal. Justice had been served, but healing would take a lifetime. Years passed, but Millbrook never shook the shadow of Caroline and Daniel's story. The town looked the same. The same quiet streets, the same church bells on Sunday mornings. But underneath, something had changed. People locked their doors earlier. Parents warned their daughters about jealous men who called too much, who followed too closely. The honeymoon murders had become a cautionary tale, woven into the town's identity like an old scar. The lodge, where Caroline and Daniel had stayed, shut down within a year. Guests didn't want to sleep in a place that had been splashed across national headlines. The cabin itself sat empty, its windows boarded up. Locals driving past sometimes swore they saw light flicker behind the curtains, though no one had stepped inside for years. Most avoided the place altogether. It wasn't haunted by spirits, they said, but by memory. For Caroline's best friend, the shadow was personal. She admitted years later, "Every time I meet someone new, I think of her. I think of how happy she was that day at the wedding. And then I remember how quickly it ended. It changed how I trust." It changed everything. Detectives who worked the case carried it too. One confessed in an interview, "I've seen a lot of crime scenes, but that grave in the woods, that stays with you." It wasn't just two bodies. It was a love story buried alive. Even strangers felt the weight. The visitors who came through Millbrook often asked, "Isn't this where the newlyweds disappeared?" Locals nodded, their voices soft, because the story wasn't gossip to them, it was loss. Mark's name faded over time. He remained in prison, aging behind concrete walls, his eyes hollow. When glimpsed in courtroom sketches or occasional articles, the community rarely spoke of him anymore. To them, he wasn't worth remembering. But Caroline and Daniel were always. Every September, the town held a vigil. Candles flickered in the square, soft prayers filled the air, and flowers were laid at a plaque engraved with their names. Children who hadn't even been born at the time stood with their parents, learning the story as part of their town's history. Caroline and Daniel weren't forgotten victims. They had become symbols of both love and loss. The shadow of their tragedy never fully left Millbrook. But in that shadow, the light of their memory still glowed. On the 14th of September 1992, off 1 year to the day after their wedding, the town of Millbrook gathered in the square. There were no wedding bells, no champagne toasts, no first dances. Instead, there were candles, hundreds of them, glowing in the cool evening air. Caroline's and Daniel's families stood at the front, side by side. Their faces were marked with grief, but also with quiet strength. A pastor spoke softly. They were taken too soon, but their love was real, and their love remains. The crowd bowed their heads, strangers wiped away tears. In that moment, Caroline and Daniel weren't remembered as victims. They were remembered as two young people who had loved deeply, who had smiled brightly, who had deserved so much more than the days they were given. Their story became more than tragedy. It became testimony. The foundation created in their names grew scholarships, sent young women to college in Caroline's honor. Daniel's youth program helped boys and girls find purpose through sports. Out of unimaginable pain, something life-giving was built. And for the families, it was a way of saying their lives mattered. They still matter. Mark's name faded into dust. He remained in prison, faceless, aging, forgotten by most. He no longer belonged to the story that mattered. Caroline and Daniel did. The town carried their memory like a compass. The parents reminded their children that true love is not about possession, but respect. Friends warned one another about jealousy, about obsession disguised as romance. Their tragedy reshaped how people understood love itself. And every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, the candles returned. The square glowed with soft flames, each one a promise. We remember, we will not let their light die. In the end, Caroline and Daniel's legacy was not defined by the grave where their bodies were found. It was defined by the love that lived on in those who spoke their names, who told their story, who learned from their loss. Their love story had been stolen, but their memory had become eternal. And as the candles flickered against the dark September night, one thing was certain. Caroline and Daniel had not vanished at all. They lived on in every flame, in every heart, in every lesson their story left behind.